Thanks for joining us today. My name is Lucy Yan. I lead business development, marketing, and operations at Northern Block. We're a Toronto-based blockchain consultancy in transition to becoming specialized in self-sovereign identity, SSI products, and services. We founded SSI Toronto in February 2020 with an aim to bring together folks in the Greater Toronto area who are interested in SSI to form a community of learning and sharing. We have had 3 successful events so far. Due to the COVID-19 situation, we had to switch to online events, which has been great because it has led us to a much wider reach beyond just Toronto and Canada. So we're excited to have our 4th event today, the first of our COVID webinar series. We're doing this because there have been heated discussions around the use of digital credentials to help reopen our societies and economies. Of course, controversies are part of it. The SSI community decided to come together at different levels, local and international, to explore what role we could play in this, knowing that the verifiable credential model, if implemented properly, could be an ideal solution to better privacy protection for individuals, while offering faster, more accurate, and trusted authentications and authorizations for organizations. To make things clear, our conversation today will not be about any specific type of credential, neither immunity passport, nor any similar type of proposed credentials that require far more clarity around the science of it, and most importantly, broader discussions around potential social consequences. Our conversation will be about a new technology that has gained maturity over the year and possesses the potential of helping us solve some urgent issues amid the COVID-19 public health crisis and in its aftermath. So the goal of this webinar is to engage folks beyond the identity and technology community, since most of you are stakeholders for such a solution. So it is important for you to evaluate the validity of ideas with us and raise questions that should become discussion points. So we're really glad to see participants from both the public and private sectors join us today. And we believe now is the perfect time to take a step back, evaluate the playing field, and ensure we're covering the right areas and involving the right stakeholders. On that, let's look at today's agenda. So we will start with speaker introductions. So each one of us will briefly introduce ourselves and our respective companies, talking about what we have done in the SSI space and our involvement in COVID and verifiable credential solutions. So following that, the 3 of us will have an open conversation on some key topics regarding the use of verifiable credentials for COVID. So you're most welcome to submit your questions to the Q&A section. We'll pick them up along the way based on the relevance to the topics, and the rest we'll address in the Q&A session in the end. So based on our prior experience, we don't usually get to all questions, but if anything, like we will go through it afterwards and we'll follow up with you if any relevant questions are not addressed. We'll either answer it ourselves or direct you to the right resources where you can find answers. So our 3 speakers today are all working at the intersection of technology and business sides in self-sovereign identity. So our topics will be revolving around these 2 aspects. So since I have the mic, so I will start first. So as I mentioned earlier, Northern Block is a blockchain consultancy in transition to the SSI space. So our founder and CEO, Mathieu, quit his rising corporate career at the Capital One Bank 3 years ago to start Northern Block because he saw the potential of blockchain as being a solution for the creation of digital trust. I joined Northern Block in its first year after my MBA. I didn't know much about the tech then, but I was fully aware of all the hype in the space. So I was very cautious, but I remember Mathieu and I only met for half an hour and we knew we wanted to work with each other. I was touched by his courage to pivot his career to entrepreneurship and his genuine commitment to leveraging technology for good. So over the past 2 years, Northern Block has worked with both enterprises and startups to help them understand the value of decentralized technologies and implement solutions using those technologies. Our first identity project was a proof of concept with the entire government to showcase how blockchain could be used to give citizens back the control of their personal information. Late last year, so we officially crossed paths with SSI community after we took on a project facilitating private firearm transfers in the US. So the importance of preserving privacy for firearm owners got us deep into the SSI full stack of SSI, which excited us. So what excited us more was the underlying technology of SSI is ready for wider adoption by businesses, large or small. And at Northern Block, our core strength is exactly speaking the business language of an emerging technology and implement it in a way that leads to double bottom line. So early this year, COVID-19 hit us. So in late March, multiple leaders in SSI space sent out strong calls to actions to the entire community to form an alliance which became what is today the COVID Credentials Initiative, CCI, a global community of individuals and organizations using verifiable credentials to open our societies and economies in a privacy-preserving way. So I joined representing Northern Bloc and volunteered to co-lead the coordination and communication workstream. So my work at CCI allowed me to have conversations with COVID verifiable credential projects around the world and work at the center of those some of the key issues to help those projects succeed. In the meantime, Northern Bloc has been engaging with potential stakeholders for COVID verifiable credential solutions in Canada, facilitating understanding of its broader use beyond health credentials. So Canada has been leading the development of the SSI technology, and we believe we can and we should lead conversations around proper strategies, taking the technology to market as well, especially in the midst of a global pandemic. So that is me. So now I'm giving the mic to Peter from TNO, who is leading the Unlock project, a community effort to combat COVID-19 in the Netherlands. So I was connected to Peter through CCI and have been very impressed by how openly and responsibly they're operating the Unlock project. Peter, the mic is yours.
Well, hello everyone. Nice that I can be here. My name is Peter. I'm from the Netherlands. So it's I'm at the end of my business day now. I think you're just beginning. I'm happy to share a bit about Unlock. First, I'll share a bit about myself and TNO. TNO is the Netherlands Organization for Applied Scientific Research. So we are a partly government-funded research organization. You have many of those in Europe, some of them in the Americas as well. And we're always on the forefront of new technology. It's our mission to make new technology that's coming out of more fundamental research, to make it applicable and to kickstart the use of that technology for cases where we think it adds value to the Dutch society, the EU, or the world. We do a lot of work in a lot of domains. One of those domains is ICT, and in that domain, I'm responsible for our SSI portfolio. It's my job to set up new projects. So I'm a business developer. I go relatively deep into the technology, but not as deep as some of my colleagues. My background is in business administration, and I was one of the initiators of the Unlock consortium. It's an effort where we work together with, I think at this moment, 8 or 9 companies. All from the Netherlands. We've all been working together previously in various SSI projects, and when we were hit by COVID, we decided to team up and to pool our efforts. So we've created the Unlock consortium. It will be the Unlock Foundation in a couple of days probably. So we're going to set up a formal foundation, and the goal of this foundation is to create the technology that allows for Dutch society to reopen in a responsible way. And for that, we're using SSI technology. But it's not just about technology. There's so much to be done regarding the legal aspects, regarding the ethical aspects, political aspects come into play. And there's also a lot to be done to organize such a consortium. We have, for instance, we have Rabobank, a big Dutch bank, which is very tech savvy in SSI. We have a law firm, one of the top firms in the Netherlands is on board. We have EY, their health audit practice is on board. Universities of Leiden and Delft, local blockchain company Ledger Leopard, Dutch blockchain coalition, which is a sort of, maybe you could say it's sort of our, you have the Toronto community, this is the Dutch community, the Dutch blockchain coalition. Together we are at this moment at the point where we have a sort of minimal viable product. We're going to do we call them pre-pilots into healthcare institutions, not really using testing at the moment, just talking to users and understanding their worries and how we can change and update our systems. But we're definitely not there yet. We're also discovering it's quite a long journey, and it's bumpy, and it's quite difficult. So I can tell you more about that. I think I'm already talking too much, so I'll give the floor to Riley, I think, and we'll talk later.
Sure. Thanks, Peter. So, hey everybody, nice to be here today. My name is Riley Hughes. I am one of the founders of and the CEO of StreetCred ID, which is a full stack self-sovereign identity technology provider. We have a platform that enables people to easily integrate verifiable credentials and self-sovereign identity technology into existing applications or to easily build new ones. My background was in private equity financing. Specifically, it was in early stage social impact investing. We were making investments in Africa and in Southeastern Europe or Asia, as well as in Europe, and was doing that for a while, and led to sort of interest in blockchain. As being a way to solve potentially some identity problems that we were seeing in Africa with regard to people who didn't have a legal identity, and happened to come across the Sovereign Foundation. At the time, it was still just a nonprofit with a board, and I was a university student at BYU, which is the same university where Phil Windley is a professor. So it kind of just worked out that kind of the thing that I was looking into, there was a professor at my university who was the chair of the board of one of the leading kind of thought leaders in the space. And so I connected with Phil, and from there I became the second employee of the Sovereign Foundation, really got involved there really early. Was there for a few years and led several of the initiatives there, including governance and business development and some of the other stuff too. And that was really awesome, and I loved it. And I really became passionate about self-sovereign identity and verifiable credentials. And after being there for a while, I realized that what was needed in this space to really get this wonderful technology that I was passionate about to be adopted was there needed to be just a really turnkey solution that any companies could integrate and use verifiable credentials without having to parse through a lot of complex open source ecosystem necessarily, or hire a consulting firm or whatever, right? I mean, they might hire a consulting firm, but it would be better if there were a really turnkey sort of product offering, and that's what we set out to do with StreetCred. My two co-founders are some of the initial contributors and originators of the Hyperledger Aries project. And once the Hyperledger Aries project was stable enough that it was ready for prime time, we all came together and started StreetCred. And when the pandemic really hit and when the economy started shutting down, I was talking with a colleague, someone who was actually using the StreetCred platform for another application, and this was maybe early February. He was talking about his idea for what could be done with verifiable credentials in the context of the pandemic. And this is before the economy was really shutting down. This is before kind of all of the hysteria in the Western societies. And we kind of decided this was something that was bigger than any one company, especially his little startup or my little startup or anything like that. This was something that was really needed to be a global effort to see how we can do this right. And so we kind of, reached out to other people in our community and ended up helping start the COVID Credentials Initiative, which is a global group of folks who are working to figure out how do we deploy verifiable credentials to solve potential problems that are raised by the pandemic in a way that's privacy preserving and scalable. So been actively involved in that ever since, and now there are several companies who are building verifiable credential solutions on our platform, and so I'm happy to talk about what I've learned through those initiatives.
Thank you,
Back
Peter.
to you, Lucy.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Riley. Just one note about StreetCred. So Northern Block, we built on their developer platform. As Riley said, it's really easy for someone, developer to get on and start doing things. And we're really impressed by their high quality work and also their high level professionalism. And now that you've learned a little bit more about the three of us and our work in the COVID and SSI space, so we're ready to start an open conversation around using the verifiable credentials to reopen our society and economy. And to avoid any confusion, I think you guys know what we mean by SSI, self-sovereign identity. So if you hear us using VC, we're VCs in our conversation, we mean verifiable credentials, not venture capitalists. So speaking of SSI and VC, so I would like to start a conversation by inviting like Riley to quickly walk us through how the technology evolved to what is today. Because like Riley, you have been, been following the space from its infancy, and share like your take on why it is ready for wider adoption.
Yeah. So when I got involved at Sovereign Foundation, the technology, there was technology that existed. In fact, the Sovereign Network, which is the underlying blockchain that powers the sort of SSI use case, was already launched and it was already running. So that was good, but there were two things that were really missing. The first is good technology and open source standards for the layer above the blockchain. So, there's a blockchain and you can anchor public keys and schemas and other things on it to facilitate verifiable credentials, but you also need a wallet to hold those verifiable credentials in. And when I got involved at Sovereign, there weren't open source wallets or really any standards to help different wallet providers be interoperable with each other. And now we are, I wouldn't say we're all the way there. It'll probably be an ongoing effort for years, but there's at least a suite of interoperability tests and protocols in the Hyperledger Aries project and with the DIDCOM protocol that enable cross-platform and cross-vendor interoperability. And we've done several of those demos. We just did one with the government of British Columbia a few weeks ago. And so the first thing that really made the technology really ready for prime time is these sort of layer 2 wallet standards and interoperability protocols. The second thing that really made, I think, the technology much more ready for real life usage is all of the work that has been done on policy and legal. I just want to reiterate what Peter said about, the technology is just like, a small fraction of what's required to really get a solution to market. The technology, in our view, is production ready, but there's still a lot of work to be done on the legal side and the policy side. But one of the things that's really been valuable is all of the work that was done at the Sovereign Foundation and funded in part by the community on GDPR thought leadership. And it actually led to deep dives into law. Led to changes in the way that the Sovereign Network was architected, and it ultimately led to sort of all user DIDs being off ledger. And there's a bunch of technical details we could talk about, but the reality is, or practically speaking, what matters is that there's been enough thinking done about how these frameworks fit into global legal regulations that I think without that, it really wouldn't be ready for prime time. You're muted, Lucy.
We have a question here that's kind of relevant to what you're talking about. So how can VC be ready for wider adoption when there's only few wallets, or when no wallets have been audited for security and privacy? What's your take on this, Riley?
So our wallets have been audited for security and privacy internally, right? I mean, we haven't. This brings up a good point, right? Like, wouldn't it be great if we had external auditors and auditor accreditors and governance bodies that accredit the auditor accreditors, and so a really robust ecosystem of trust, right? I think just we're early, so we're not going to be there, right? There's no business model for an accreditor when, like you said, there's only a few wallets. But yeah, we've done, we had external audits done on our security on both the open source wallet code as well as the street cred wallet. And so that's a comment on that part. The other part is, there are only a few wallets, but that doesn't mean that they can't be used in prime time. The standards and the open source, the open source standards for developing wallets are there. The building blocks are there, and there are open source reference code bases that you can go and build your own wallet today if you wanted to. So, you know, I don't think there's perfect answers to those questions because we're still early, but I think we're ready enough that we don't need to keep stalling. We can go ahead and move some things into production.
Thank you, Riley. Just to add a little bit of context here, the open source code Riley was talking about, they kind of both were donated to the community, are one of the main kind of resources for the entire community to build on wallet on. So they're kind of at least gave us a little bit comfort because that code is not just managed by one company, like a private company. It's kind of open to the entire community to criticize or audit. So that's a little bit context here. Peter, can you share a little bit more, like what's your thought process at TNO when you started the Unlock project in terms of like evaluating the readiness of the technology?
Yeah, I can sort of, based on what Riley said, in our consortium, we have one law firm and one bank. So we are following also quite a rigorous approach to having all the regulatory checks done on our expo. So the regulatory compliance is involved in the process, but it's also one of the first times in the Netherlands that we're actually doing this. And so I agree with Riley that technology-wise it works, but there is not yet sufficient paperwork filled out to prove that it works also to non-technical people, right? And so I think I see this actually as a boost. This is for us the first time that we're working together with all these companies to combine all this brain power from both the legal side, the compliance side, and it will at least give us a very strong framework. What I think we're also learning is that you're not auditing just the technical component or the wallet, you're auditing the whole system. So also how you connect to certain health data, how you deal with this health data. There's a lot of rules and regulations around it that have nothing to do with SSI, but you need to follow them. And I think we're now at this point learning more and more that this is quite complex. At least in the Netherlands, it's quite complex, but I don't think it will be much different overseas. So I think the maturity is more that the people you're also talking to don't know what SSI is. So sometimes you need to reorient the way they're thinking, how they would typically do such a legal audit. It changes when you're talking decentralized. And it doesn't even matter if it's SSI or blockchain or multi-party computation or other decentralized technologies. It just requires a different mindset, especially from legal people, is my feeling. So I'm happy we found a law firm that is quite into technology and is actively, I think CMS is great in this aspect that they have this sort of tech-focused practice. So that's also something I recommend, is to get such lawyers into the community that are that understand technology and that are willing to help. Yeah, and I think also the standards that Riley is referring to, we're using the same. We're also using Aries, Indy, DITCOM standards. So I think the whole world is sort of converging towards these technologies. And are they production ready? Yes, for certain use cases they are, and I think you can easily build a point solution now. It's still hard to build the fully interoperable solution if you're talking COVID. If you want to build a system where people can fly from all over the world and use their local health data in any other place in the world, technically you might be able to pull it off, but there's still some difficulties in the policies and how you change them, and how do you I think one of the things that is for us quite interesting is what they're now calling local assurance communities. So how do you know who to trust? In the Netherlands, we know which laboratory is a real laboratory, but we don't know this from a country across the globe. And it's very hard to determine who should you then trust to point out which are the legit laboratories and which are non-legit. And how does this work in countries that have a malfunctioning legal system and have a lot of corruption and bribery, right? So those are also things that are being developed in the standards community, but they're not fully. You cannot just pick them off the shelf. You need to think about this. So I'm seeing sort of the global use cases, especially about travel, I think are still quite complicated.
Thank you both. because as we're talking about, there are like a bunch of like non-technical people, or like people not from the SSI space, probably who don't understand the tech enough. So I prepare a very, very simple kind of graph to show, because if some of you like have been following the SSI space, probably you've heard of trust over IP stack, but that's like a very simplified version I'm showing here. Is for if you're talking about the full stack, we're talking about stack for technology and stack for governance. And the governance, like that's something we've been discussing, even like the global initiative that all the three of us are part of. We're not only talking about the governance, there are different sides, how the technology should work, and also on the human side, how human organizations should interact with each other. So we're actively discussing these issues, and even though some of the problems or issues still need to be resolved. Just to give, like, for those of you who are new to technology or SSI specifically, I want to provide here a very high level and simplified idea of what we mean by ready. So at least, so there are 4 layers that form the SSI technology stack. So I believe most, like the 3 of our companies are mainly working at the layer 3 and layer 4. And I think Riley's company, they're contributing like a lot to the layer 1, layer 2 as well. So for Northern Block, we are at 90% like a layer 4. So like it took some time for layer 1 and layer 2 to take shape and for things to standardize as those 2 layers. That's what Riley was talking about. And some of you may know that Verifiable Credentials have officially become a W3C standard last year. So while standardization of DIT, decentralized identifier, is still like mission almost accomplished. And thanks to maturity and standardization at the foundational layers, so companies such as 3Grad are able to create platform and tooling at layer 3 for companies like Northern Block to build, or TNO to build business applications at layer 4. So our work at top layers are important for the further development and standardization at bottom layers, while we're also counting on the bottom layers to keep evolving to improve stability, usability, security, and unlock new functionalities. So that's the reason why when we're talking about a wider adoption, it's not about, okay, it's everything is ready. It's like what the work we're doing at adoption level will help the fundamental layers of technology to keep evolving. And I hope this is helpful for those of you who are not technical. So now that we have some kind of grounds, some of the grounds for even like having a conversation today on using like Verifiable Credential or SSI for production level COVID solution. So let's talk about a little bit more where we can use this technology for COVID specifically and how it is better. I think someone is asking how it is better, how this better than other digital credentialing technology. So I would like to invite Riley to briefly comment on this, how this is better. Like, let's start with this, because like someone already asking how this is better than other digital credentials. Why Verifiable Credential is a better kind of option in this context.
Yeah, so there's a few things to comment on here. And keeping it for a pretty sort of for a non-technical audience. I mean, there's a lot of technical reasons, and that the technologists and purists will geek out about how cool this stuff is. But for practically speaking, the reason verifiable credentials are unique is that you can so individuals can prove something about themselves directly without needing it to be sort of verified by some third party. From the other perspective, businesses or organizations can verify, or individuals, frankly, can verify things without needing some integration to some third party verifier or anything like that, right? So what this practically could look like is, the easy example is there's maybe a driving license division that would issue a driving license to somebody, and they could take that driver's license to a bank, and the bank could verify that it's actually a driver's license and that it's legitimate and that the attributes inside were vouched for by the bank, and all of these things, and that it hasn't been tampered with and it's not revoked, and all these things about that credential without having to have an integration to the DMV itself to ask, right? So this is really interesting when you look at sort of scaling these systems like Peter's talking about with these travel use cases. Imagine if you needed to have an integration with every laboratory in the world in order to verify, that their certificates are legitimate. There would probably be some third party that would step in and say, create all the integrations with all the laboratories and then charge a big fee to perform that verification or something. What Verifiable Credentials allows us to do is solve that technical problem right? About the verification and integrations. You know, then the problem becomes maybe a policy problem, and that's what we're talking about here. It's what Peter's talking about. You know, how do you know who to trust? It's a governance and policy issue, but the technical issue is sort of solved. And so I guess does that answer the question, Lucy?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Riley. Peter, do you want to add a little bit here? Because I know that when you're talking about the Unlock project, privacy by design is something like your kind of one of your unique value propositions. So how when you're talking about this, how people are responding to the privacy, the value?
I think one of the typical use cases I always use when explaining how verifiable credentials can give you privacy is in the Netherlands. If you're buying alcohol, you're allowed to buy it when you're over 18, and you need to ID yourself at a shop, and then typically you show your driver's license. In this case, the driver's license authority doesn't do any checks because the document is self-sovereign, but still you're sharing a lot of information in this credential. For instance, you're sharing your where you've been born and your name and your birth date. And based on your birth date, they can check against the policy, are you older than 18? If you're talking about verified credentials, you can also make credentials that just state, I am a existing person that is older than 18, right? And that is something you can prove. And you can prove that without the organization that has provided this credential knowing that you're buying alcohol, because it's none of their business. And I think this is sort of how this is a very basic explanation of what we're talking about, privacy by design. I think sometimes a better word is minimalization of the data minimalization, only showing the questions that you really, only showing the information you really want to share. And also in verifiable credentials, we're always talking about it's like a question and answer game. Because actually the way Unlock works, it's when you arrive somewhere with your credential, somebody asks for your credential. So the first step is somebody says, hi, I am on the street would be, hi, I'm a police officer. Can I please see see some information? Then you say, prove me you're a police officer. Why are you asking me this information? And then they show a badge and they say, it's because you're speeding. And then you present your information. We want to achieve the same in the digital world. So if you walk into a hospital and they ask for a health certificate, first they say, we are a hospital, we have this is our policy. We identify ourselves with our, nicely signed with our digital signatures. And this is the question we ask you with this goal. This is also the core of the GDPR. You always need to state why you're asking information. And then it's up to the holder or the person having the test done, if he's willing to share his information. So he knows the information he is sharing. He also knows the policy he's sharing it towards. So he already actually knows the answer before he shares the information. So also if the answer is no, you cannot come in, there's actually no need to even share your credentials. You can just walk away. And these are two examples of what I mean by privacy by design. And also the fact that if somebody asks you, can I please see your health certificate to enter a bar? In the Netherlands at this point, this would be against a lot of regulations. The person has the information that a bar asked them for a health certificate. And with that information, they can go to the privacy authority in the Netherlands who could then take action. Without revealing any information about yourself, you have these information stored in your wallet. So these are actually 3 examples then of what we are trying to add here, because at least in the Netherlands, health certificates are a very, very tricky topic, privacy-wise, ethically. It's sort of we are now only starting to understand what are the impacts of the COVID crisis, and we are also still struggling with what are the solutions. So every idea is sort of met with both a lot of enthusiasm and also a lot of skepticism. So I think that's why we're also aiming at this privacy by design approach. But there's also a bit what we call ethics by design. And we're saying, well, in some cases, it might not be ethically correct to ask people for a health certificate. You can get negative effects in society. You can exclude people from public spaces, for instance. We don't think that's a good idea. And also you can use credentials, and I can go on about how you could do that technically, but you can use credentials to make sure that only people, only verified verifiers are able to ask you those kind of questions. So that's also how we try to incorporate some of the ethical principles of actually of our society into the technology. And that is quite new and I think that's very exciting. And we have some nice cooperation there with two Dutch universities which we together try to figure this out, because we think this is one of the points, at least in Europe, where these sort of the technologies at this point, sort of the contacts tracing apps in Europe are at this point not being adopted too much, because they're not so well designed around the sort of European values, you could say, which are privacy and which are the sort of individualism, and governments cannot mandate that you use a certain app or give away certain information. So that's our direction.
Cool. Thank you, both of you. So I hope like it's like from our perspective, it's like the privacy, like the use of verifiable credential for privacy protection for individuals is definitely a huge kind of plus compared to other alternatives, and also in terms of because it is at the hand of the user. So it's not only like you have to do it again and again. There are also a convenience kind of benefits when it comes to you have to go to different places to get access to different places. And I think we've talked, like Peter has mentioned a lot about health credentials. And what I want to kind of show everyone here is just beyond health credentials, what else we can think about, or how this technology can be used. So here. So what I'm trying to do here is just throw some thoughts to encourage you to think broader about how this technology can help beyond just having like some kind of like path toward warehouse related credentials. So here are 3 groups of use cases. So I summarize it based on the different business scenarios. So essentially they're all access management, either physical or digital. So the first group is where a lot of conversations are happening, whether it's about health credentials or other type of credentials. The idea is to get you to public spaces where access public resources. And what I want to focus a little bit more on the second and the third one. So different from group 1, the second group is about certain workers are required to fulfill their duties at different locations, which may cause safety and security issues if we don't manage their access well. And not only safety and security, but also for certain professions, certain positions, like speed is also very important. So that's the reason why like the NHS, National Health Services in England, are beginning trials of digital staff passports in coming weeks to make it easier for health workers to move between organizations during the coronavirus pandemic, so that they can get authenticated quickly without necessary bureaucracy. So another like kind of like scenario is, think about we're now because we're all like staying at home, we need a lot of stuff delivered to our door. So that is why we have seen more cases where people get robbed by others, pretending to be people that they're not, right? So therefore, a certain authentication process in place becomes more necessary than before. So that's like another like kind of area where we're thinking probably there are use cases where variable business cases. And the third group is about because we won't be able to access many services, either because we can't go out where they're closed. So even when things get better, so we'll still at least have to stay cautious for a long period of time. So that is giving many online service platforms such as Doctor on Demand to thrive. So, but are those businesses ready to take a huge influx of new service providers, therapists or doctors? So while people are in desperate need of those services. So this is like our thoughts regarding how verifiable credentials can help, as many of those service providers are listing themselves, online, and not only on one place. Think about if you're a doctor, so you're definitely not trying to get on one platform. You want to list yourself on different platforms. So you have to do like the same process probably again and again and again. Hopefully, they're doing it properly. So if there's some kind of system in place that can help you get on board faster, and also like for the platform to make sure that the person who claims to be a doctor actually has the qualifications. So that's where another like a group of use cases like we're thinking about. And I don't know if you have noticed, so many of the use cases are not just like the COVID. It can be beyond just for COVID. It still have value like when COVID, and hopefully COVID can end soon. So I don't know if there are any like other use cases or things like the two of you want to add here. Anything like you want to add?
I mean, there's a lot of contactless stuff that we're seeing, right? So think, you know, like you've mentioned, access management to buildings or services, right? Access to prescriptions in a contactless way, proving that you've been prescribed something. There's use cases we're seeing in the supply chain vertical, you know, regarding essential supply chains and optimizing things for this new normal. And so I just echo what you're saying, right? There are people who are interested in doing health certificates or whatever for you know, COVID test results and things like that. Immunity passports, you know, those types of things are being thought about and worked on, but I would even say that they are actually a minority, you know, a small minority of the total things that people are working on using verifiable credentials to address the myriad of issues that are risen by the current pandemic.
Cool, thank you, Riley. Peter, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I know there's also cases, for instance, in the Netherlands, there's a lot of subsidies now being granted to people working in certain sectors or businesses working active in certain sectors, for instance, bars and events and sports, and they're all, due to our lockdown, they're now all in a very bad shape financially. And it's actually quite hard to prove that you are a business working in such a field. And that you comply to, I don't know how many other rules that are there now. And I think that's also a very good case for credentials. So it's not credentials of people then, but credentials of legal entities, for instance, of businesses, but also the self-employed. How can you prove as a self-employed that you are actually working in such a field? That can be quite hard. So it's hard to prove to those systems. And in the Netherlands, it took weeks, and I think there were like 50,000 calls a day at these call centers for people trying to get through to get this kind of money, this support money. And I think it's very important that people get it fast. And in this case, again, you could actually run the whole policy and already see if you comply, and then if you send it in, you can get it instantly. So it could greatly speed up the transaction times in those kind of systems.
Thank you. So to be very honest, having worked in emerging technologies for some time, so I'm kind of like tired of the word like use cases, because everything is very conceptual at the use case level. So more action need to be taken to validate are those use cases actually, you know, can be turned into viable business cases. Not necessarily, you know, we're saying making money out of it. Are those use cases worth built on so that we can actually deliver value to those people who are in need? So now let's talk about some real projects. So at CCI, the global, the COVID credential initiative, so we're having a lot of discussions to get more clarity on who we are, what we do. So one thing we have reached certain consensus is we want to create some tangible outcomes by supporting existing VC local, like verifiable credential projects and help them succeed. So I've created a slide. So as Riley mentioned, there are a lot of like projects that are not about health credentials. But I think just one thing to clarify, like there are commercial projects and community projects. A lot of commercial projects are kind of in stealth mode. So that's something I don't have a lot of insights into. But so what I'm like kind of trying to categorize is the most projects I know are the community projects. So based on my observations and conversations so far, so if we divide the go-to-market of a solution into 5 steps, so I haven't seen a project that passed like step 3. So if we don't count those like in ideations, which could be a lot, most projects are stuck at the prototype stage. So the interesting about these projects is that they're mostly driven by the supply side, which I mean the technical people who are passionate about building a solution for COVID, but not necessarily having the resources and know-how to take it to market. So this is not a new problem for any technology when it just passes infancy. So, but given the urgency of the problem we're trying to solve here, not engaging stakeholders in the beginning stage, you know, before a prototype is built, is definitely like not a good idea. So, and it's very likely you're building on something like that is not even like validated. So I want here like Peter and Riley, I want to see like what's your, let's start with Peter. Like what's your what stakeholders have you engaged? So like what you mentioned like you're pilot, right? What are the challenges that you're facing, and what stakeholders you have engaged so far?
Well, we've involved many stakeholders, I think, because we have and I think the most important stakeholders for us were actually the health organizations and health institutions that set certain rules and policies. So we have some of them involved in, some different working groups where we have people from healthcare joining. We are following a bit of a different path, I think, than here on the screen, because we are actually we're trying to get outside as quick as we can. So we're doing these pilots. In SSI, you typically have 3 different roles. One of them is the issuer of credentials, one of them is the holder, one of them is the verifier. And we're the first pilots we're doing is with holders and verifiers in the healthcare domain. So those are health workers and desk workers at the healthcare desk where you enter the facility. And we are now very quickly doing sort of user testing with them and showing them the prototype without actually doing any tests, because legally we cannot do so yet. So we're doing 2 of those, what we call pre-pilots, and we're also looking now to do the issuing part. So we're still struggling to find a lab that will actually issue these credentials alongside a medical test. We at TNO, for instance, we're also we can do corona testing. We also have a health branch where we have the capacity to do corona testing, but legally we cannot do that for a medical reason, only for a research reason at this point. So that could be for us our sort of contained pilot, but at this point it's not yet allowed. So we cannot. So we're looking for a way to do real pilots using a real test lab, and that's again where you run into the policy part. Because in the Netherlands, we have a policy saying we only test if you have symptoms. The Dutch policy is all based around symptoms. It's not about sort of doing preventive testing. There's a lot of discussion now about there's companies who say, hey, you can go on holidays if you get a preventive test, and then you fly back into Turkey, and you go on holiday, you get tested there again, and then you fly back, you get tested the 3rd time, and then you can have sort of a safe or less risky holiday. And we're still in a societal discussion if this is a good idea or not. And also in the Netherlands, we have limited testing capacity. So there's a lot of those discussions, and they're more with policymakers or with all different stakeholders involved, rather than just saying we're going to move to the next phase and do a scaled pilot. Because we have these policy issues to solve first. So we try to be creative and see how we can approach it. And so you had a question, Lucy. I just kept rambling.
I think you've covered what I'm trying to ask.
Okay.
Yeah, what stakeholders are all the challenges, and it's good that you guys are taking steps back and think about if this is even a good idea. Yeah.
I think for us one of the challenges is to, I think bluntly, is that there is now a certain policy in the Netherlands that doesn't involve the things we're working on. Mm-hmm. So it's very hard to get people from the official government side to back into your idea. It might become relevant in a month. It might become policy in 2 months. We are, I think, projecting into the future. But it's at this point very hard to get those people on board because they cannot, because there is a certain policy and they cannot break the policy. So that's, I think, one of our struggles at this point.
Thank you.
And we don't know how to solve it yet. We're just talking to everyone we can. That's our approach.
So I think the good thing is that you guys are talking with stakeholders. So that is a very, very good step.
Yeah.
So Riley,
Lucy, I'll just comment, but I'll be brief here. I want to reiterate one thing that you said, which is that a lot of the commercial projects are in stealth mode, and we have NDAs and things like that. But I'll say that there are sort of I don't know really what the line is between contained pilot and scaled pilot, but there are pilots happening right now with verifiable credentials to address issues raised by the pandemic, which is an exciting thing to see. The way that we're helping people overcome these issues with stakeholders is in the CCI use cases group. There's a subgroup that was focused just on go-to-market. And there was a group of us that really just hunkered down for a week and really sort of crafted a framework. It's a 5-step framework that anybody can use to validate a verifiable credentials use case. It's written specifically for COVID use cases, but not, it applies more broadly. I will drop a link here in the chat. I wrote a blog post about that, or we did, my company. We interviewed the leader of that subgroup. And so if you're interested in that framework, it's a 5-step framework to validating verifiable credentials ideas. You can check out the blog post, and I think it gives a very good starting point to really validating with all the different stakeholders in the system.
Cool. Thank you, Riley. I'm part of that group as well. I have a comment later, but before I comment myself, like Riley, I have a follow-up question, because you mentioned that you guys have few projects building on your platform. So can you share with us high level, what are the challenges they're facing? It's good to know that some of them are moving to like the pilot stage, but what are like the challenges you've seen?
I mean, the challenges won't surprise you, right? The challenges are policy challenges, just like Peter's talking about, right? There are legal challenges as well. There are exclusion and sort of fairness, ethical challenges as well, right? If all of society suddenly says that you need credentials in order to move around, what do people who don't have smartphones do? How do they manage, right? And so there's a lot of challenges broadly that this space needs to address. And I don't think challenges should stop us from trying to make improvements on the status quo, but they're definitely things we should be considering and thinking about from the outset and trying to solve for. Another sort of common challenge is just the fact that if you're looking at the medical use case, labs are busy, and doctors are busy, and clinics are busy, and adding a new technology into the mix is it's a hard sell. And so sort of balancing the selling the value versus the practical implementation challenges is something that will always need to be balanced.
Thank you. So as we were talking about, I just want to show this the slides to everyone, just to kind of just have like a mental picture of like the stakeholders, like the issuers and verifiers and holders. And not only that, because like, as Riley and Peter were talking about, like government is probably not issuer or verifier or holder, but because like the house, like Peter mentioned, a lot of the problems they're trying to solve is not stuck because of technology, it's because the policy, like legislation, is not there. So even though like there's huge demand from the verifier side, so if you're looking at the framework and Riley was talking about, there's huge demand to verify people, and the issuer, even though they're not busy, but still, like I've heard like a lot of testing labs are like, oh, I don't know, even medical professionals, they're concerned about if it's legal, where their legal liabilities to comment or say anything, on any of the health-related credentials. So if on the legislation, on the policy side, even like someone like government is not like part of any of this like a triangle, it's still important that stakeholders we need to consider. So that's like one of at least my takeaway from something like we like in the framework like we developed, we haven't emphasized enough like how important it is for someone like a government, like legal, to get involved, even though they're not like part of the triangle. So lastly, as we're only 5 minutes, so there's some like interesting there's some topics that I already think like people raise questions about, how in terms of inclusion, and what if like people can't manage their SSIs. So there are like governance and the ethics and the legal issue we've touched upon, which are the challenges that moving those projects forward were knowing if these projects are even valid, because the three of us we're not like experts in that, but I think it's important to highlight these issues that we haven't covered in depth today, especially regarding the governance. As we mentioned, it's not only the technology, but also how to govern like the people and the stakeholders. So if you guys want to learn more about the governance, I recommend you to go check it out. The Trust Over IP Foundation, which is part of the Linux Foundation, which was just launched like a week or 2 weeks ago, and which are all three of our companies are founding members. And also like Peter mentioned that they have an ethics board, and which he already shared about like how they work with the ethics board to, to ongoing process to check if they're doing is ethical. And I think, Riley, I noticed that you have the interview with an inclusion expert on the digital inclusion and COVID-19 kind of topic. Can you just very briefly, what is your key points just related to our today's conversation?
Yeah, the key point is very simple, and it's that you can't add it in after the fact as an afterthought, right? Inclusion and ethics need to be thought about from the outset. It's sort of like when you're building technology, you can't just go in and try to add privacy protection in as an afterthought later. That, we've seen with the internet, that just doesn't work. It must be built in from the beginning in order to be sound and scalable and resilient enough to last into the future and really accomplish what we want it to accomplish. So we did an interview, as Lucy said, with somebody who is a digital inclusion expert, also an expert in self-sovereign identity, and sort of touched on some of these complex topics. And I just, if you're interested, I encourage you to go read more about what she said. But yeah, that's the main takeaway.
Cool.
Yeah, I can give you a really simple idea of what these ethics people do. For instance, in our app, we had a statement on the verifier saying green, somebody can enter, red, somebody cannot. Now it has changed into a sort of a color that has no meaning to the outside world, just to the, so that's a very sort of small change in the system. They say, well, if you make it yellow and blue instead of red and green, it feels less discriminatory if you get a red sign. You don't have to be embarrassed if you're standing in a line and the guard has a phone with a red sign, to boop, and a sound goes off. Mm-hmm. You feel different. So these are sort of very small hints that we get from them. This is the most basic one, but it's actually something we never thought of. We thought it's just easy for the guard to have red and green.
That's good to know. Thank you. I have one last note on the legal side. So a good news that coming from California. So there's a bill being deliberated on using Verifiable Credentials to issue test results in California. So there have been some good progress made. So I think my colleague is sharing a link. If you wanted to know more about that, feel free to check it out. And if this bill can pass, it's definitely a huge step forward for the entire SSI community. So on that, I would just like to briefly conclude our session today by sharing a quote from Peter from one of our earlier conversations. So he said, "We don't know everything." So which is exactly the spirit of our today's conversation. So COVID happens at a time when the technology just became ready. Some have questioned if our goal of the SSI community is trying to capitalize on the pandemic. My answer is no. So we're a group of people who see the value of this technology in combating the pandemic and want to deliver the value to most people, to the most needed. So this motivates us to come out of our little community and find out what we don't know, which is if we can actually help, and how we can help. So, and we need your help to understand it better. So on that, I want to thank everyone again for joining us, and Riley and Peter for taking the time to speak to us. And we'll be releasing information about our next webinar soon, and feel free to let us know if you want to hear a specific topic. Thanks again, everyone. Hope to see you next time.